A homeless old man, cloaked in a faded military jacket who caught on the spot after stealing a loaf of bread because he was starving. A trial that seemed straightforward until the judge read his name. John Northwind. The judge froze. No one understood why he suddenly declared, "Court is adjourned for 15 minutes. What could cause the scales of justice to falter? And who truly is John Northwind? Welcome to TNM. Let's uncover what really happened." Milton Harbor was a small coastal town in northern Maine, where winters arrived early and lingered like the heavy silence in a forgotten memory. Tucked into a forgotten corner near the abandoned train station, an old brick relic from the 1970s, sat a man with a weathered army jacket and a tattered backpack. No one knew his name. They just called him Northwind Joe. Joe never begged. He picked up aluminum cans to trade for spare change and warmed himself by the back oven of a local pizza shop. Kids called him the Lost Soldier, mostly because of the dull, scratched military dog tag he wore like a medal of a war long over, if it ever ended at all. The wind in Milton was cruel, cutting through layers of clothing, but Joe sat still, like a statue guarding something only he remembered. Not much ever happened in Milton, but one chilly evening in early November, something did happen, minor in the eyes of the world, but it would shake the town to its core. Joe was arrested for stealing. It happened at Walker's Mart, the only general store within a mile. Mr. Cal Walker, the owner, was known for his strict views on order. In the security footage, Joe can be seen sliding a loaf of bread and a pack of cold cuts into his jacket. He wasn't sneaky. He wasn't in a hurry. He looked more like a man trying to survive another night. "Stop right there," Cal shouted, having caught the act through the convex mirror above the register. "You're stealing. I'm calling the police." Joe didn't run, didn't argue. "I just needed something to make it through tonight," he said in a voice deep and dry, like a forest wind rattling dead leaves. When the police arrived, a young officer named Devin Carter noticed the faded dog tag around Joe's neck. He paused, his voice softer than expected. "Sir, you really served?" Joe simply nodded. That was all. And then they cuffed him. Those hands that once held rifles, rescued comrades, and signed discharge papers, now bound for taking a 89-cent loaf of bread. The next morning, Joe appeared in courtroom number 4 at the Milton County Courthouse. No family, no lawyer, just silence. The judge presiding that day was Ethan R. Mercer, known for his rigid, no-nonsense approach. As he read the case file, his eyes stopped on one line. Jonathan K. Thorne, former Staff Sergeant, U.S. Marine Corps. For a moment, Mercer froze. The courtroom grew still. He stood up, uncharacteristically rattled. "Court is in recess." 15 minutes, he said abruptly. Behind the closed doors of that courtroom, something shifted, something old and buried. Not just in the life of Joe, but perhaps in the conscience of a whole country. And that was only the beginning. 15 minutes turned into an hour. Judge Ethan Mercer locked his office door behind him and descended into the courthouse basement, an archive room no one visited unless they had to. He walked with purpose, as if chasing a ghost only he could see. His breath fogged slightly in the cool, musty air, echoing the scent of old paper and time forgotten. He found it after 20 minutes of searching. An old manila file, stamped with a fading red ink, classified, USMC, 2003. Inside, worn and yellowed, were reports, commendations, mission logs, and a photo. Ethan held it in his shaking hands. It was a grainy shot of 7 Marines standing in the desert sun. Dust, sweat, and fatigue painted their faces. And at the center, hard to mistake even with age, stood a younger version of the man in his courtroom. Joe. No, not Joe. Jonathan Thorne. Next to him in that photo, Ethan himself. Back when he was Corporal Mercer. His knees buckled slightly as the realization hit him. This man, the same one arrested for stealing a loaf of bread, once dragged him out of a burning Humvee in Fallujah, saved his life. He hadn't seen Thorne since the medevac. The military never told him what happened after. And now, here he was, in his courtroom. A ghost not from war, but from what came after. Back upstairs, Officer Devin Carter waited outside the judge's office. Young, clean-cut, and fresh out of academy training, he shifted nervously. He had seen homeless veterans before, but something about this one felt different. Real. Heavy. Like the man carried stories that could drown oceans. When Mercer finally emerged, his eyes looked older. He didn't say much. "Find out everything you can on Thorne," he told Carter. "Not just police records. VA files. Discharge status. Last known address. Get it all? Yes, sir. Devin replied. Can I ask why? The judge paused, looked out the frosted window into the gray morning beyond. Because that man saved my life, he said quietly. And it looks like no one's been there to save his. Meanwhile, in holding cell B3, Jonathan sat with his hands in his lap. He stared at the floor, eyes not quite open, not quite closed. Just somewhere else. A guard passed by, tossing him a peanut butter sandwich and a tiny box of juice. Dinner, the guard muttered. Jonathan didn't even look up. It wasn't the cell that trapped him. It was the years, the noise, the silence, the friends gone, the system broken. No one had ever asked what happened to him after the war. No one cared why he was sleeping on benches, eating out of trash bins, or why he never fought back when they called him a bum. But now someone did. Someone remembered. And someone had just opened a door no one had dared touch in decades. Milton Harbor was quiet that Sunday morning, the kind of cold that made even the seagulls too tired to scream. The streets were empty, save for the low hum of Devin Carter's cruiser as it pulled into the edge of town near the forgotten part of Industrial Avenue. He had followed the trail to a building that no longer had a name, just a peeled metal sign that once read Veteran Outreach Center. Inside, dust danced in the sunbeams leaking through shattered glass panes. Devin had found the name in an old document. Jonathan Thorne had listed it as a resource contact after his discharge. That was 2005. The center had shut down in 2011 due to lack of funding. Devin walked through the ruins. Old posters flapped weakly on the walls, messages like, "You're not alone," and "Healing starts here." It was bitter irony now. Alone was exactly what Jonathan had been. But behind a rusted desk, he found something. An old clipboard left behind, almost fossilized. The last page was faded, but legible. Client, Thorne, J.K. Date, March 17, 2006. Note, symptoms consistent with PTSD. Recommended for follow-up therapy and housing program enrollment. No response from VA after 3 attempts. 3 attempts. And then, nothing. Devin stood there, holding that page like it was evidence from a crime scene, because it was. A crime of forgetting. Back at the courthouse, Judge Mercer was reading something else, a transcript from a military tribunal. Jonathan Thorne had been discharged with honors, but without benefits. The reason? Insubordination during an operation in Mosul. But as Ethan read deeper, the picture changed. Thorne had refused an order to fire on a building suspected of harboring insurgents. Intelligence had been weak. He'd insisted civilians might be inside. He was right. Later reports confirmed 3 children and a woman had been sheltering there. His refusal likely saved their lives. But it also cost him everything. Benefits denied. Reputation stained. Medical records lost in bureaucracy. The system didn't reward quiet heroism, it erased it. Meanwhile, in holding cell B3, something stirred. A visitor arrived. Not a lawyer. Not an officer. Her name was Rosa Lane, a former nurse who volunteered at the homeless shelter once a week. She had brought soup in a thermos and a knitted beanie she'd made herself. "I remember you," she said softly as she sat on the bench across from Jonathan. He didn't respond. "You came in once. Years ago. Wouldn't take a cot. Just asked if we had coffee. I made you a cup. You said thank you, like I'd handed you gold." Silence. Then his lips cracked slightly. "It was gold." She smiled. Then, more serious, "You need someone to speak for you, Jonathan. This isn't justice. It's just the end of a long mistake." He looked at her, really looked, maybe for the first time in years. "You can't fix broken systems with soup," he said. "No," Rosa replied. "But you can start with one man. And one story." Later that evening, as darkness fell like a blanket over Milton Harbor, Devin returned to Judge Mercer's office, laying down a stack of findings like puzzle pieces. "You were right," he said. "He's been forgotten, chewed up by every part of the system meant to help him." The judge leaned back, silent, his fingers steepled in front of him. "He deserves more than freedom," Devin added. "He deserves recognition. He deserves to be seen." Judge Mercer's eyes burned, not with rage, but with a kind of grief that had turned sharp with age. "Then we make the world see him." He stood up, walked to his desk, and began drafting something he hadn't written in years. A petition, a request for expungement, and, perhaps, an apology in the form of justice. In the town of Milton Harbor, something had begun. It wasn't loud. It wasn't televised. But it was real. And like all true change, it started not with power, but with the willingness to remember. The video was never meant to go viral. It started with Rosa Lane. On a quiet Tuesday, she recorded a short message on her phone. Her voice trembled slightly as she sat on the steps of the Milton County Courthouse, holding the thermos Jonathan once drank from like it was a relic of a fallen soldier. His name is Jonathan Thorne. He served our country with honor. He returned with scars no one could see, and the only medals he ever received were nightmares, silence, and a cell. This isn't justice. This is erasure. And it's happening more than we care to admit. That was it. No music. No fancy edits. Just the truth. And the internet listened. Within 48 hours, the clip spread across social media like wildfire. Veterans forums picked it up first. Then advocacy groups. Then the mainstream outlets. Hashtags bloomed like flowers after a storm. Hashtag Remember Thorne. Hashtag Forgotten Heroes. Hashtag Justice for Jonathan. The media storm reached Milton Harbor before the judge had time to draft a proper statement. Interview requests flooded the courthouse. Reporters camped outside the detention center. Activists demanded to speak with Thorne. A petition calling for his immediate release and medical reparations hit 250,000 signatures in 3 days. But Jonathan didn't want the attention. He sat in his cell, watching the chaos unfold on the news. His face blank. His heart conflicted. He hadn't asked to be a symbol. He wasn't trying to become anyone's hashtag. He just wanted to sleep without the dreams. Devin Carter, now unofficially leading the charge for Thorne's defense, tried to manage the tidal wave. At a town hall, he stepped forward before a packed crowd. Locals, out-of-towners, veterans, journalists, skeptics, believers. He took a breath. "We are not here today because of outrage," he said. "We are here because of a wound, one that never healed." Jonathan Thorne didn't just fall through the cracks. The system dug the hole. And now we're looking in and finally asking, how deep does it go? Silence followed. Then applause. Not thunderous, but sincere. People were listening. For the first time in a long time. Meanwhile, in a quiet suburb 3 states away, Captain Isaac Grant sat in his living room watching Thorne's face on the TV. He hadn't seen him since Mosul. Since the day Thorne refused to follow orders and paid the price. Grant had kept quiet back then, pressured by command, told to testify in a way that preserved morale. He had complied, but he hadn't forgotten. He stood up, walked to his desk, and opened an old lockbox. Inside, a letter he'd written 10 years ago but never sent. "John, you were right. I was wrong. I watched you fall so I could stay standing. I don't know if you'll ever read this, but if you do, I want you to know, I'm ready to speak." Now he was elsewhere, at the Department of Veterans Affairs. A mid-level official named Elaine Moss was watching the storm grow. She'd seen it before, outrage followed by silence. But something about this case felt different. Maybe it was the timing. Maybe the country was finally tired of losing its conscience. She pulled up Thorne's old records. Or tried to. They were incomplete, redacted, lost in migration. The oldest bureaucratic excuse in the book. But Elaine didn't give up. She pulled favors, called friends, dug deeper. What she found sent a chill through her spine. A memo, classified, signed by a defense contractor, Scepter Dynamics. It referenced Thorne's case. Not just his discharge, but something more. Containment recommended. Subject risk, high. Public exposure could damage operational integrity of Project Echo. Elaine printed the file. She didn't know what Project Echo was, but she had a bad feeling. This wasn't just about a forgotten veteran anymore. This was about a buried truth. Back in Milton Harbor, Rosa brought Jonathan a newspaper. His photo was on the front page. "You're not invisible anymore," she said. Jonathan stared at it for a long time, then whispered, "I was safer when I was." The Capitol building in Washington, D.C. had seen its fair share of hearings, but room 412 hadn't buzzed like this in years. Cameras were set up early. Every seat taken. Journalists lined the back wall like vultures waiting for the first drop of blood. And at the center of it all, under oath and under fire, sat Captain Isaac Grant. "I was told not to speak," he said calmly, fingers laced together on the table. "But I've carried the truth for 10 years. It's time." The chairman leaned forward. "And what exactly is the truth, Captain?" Grant exhaled, as if preparing to throw himself off a cliff. "That Jonathan Thorne was made into something the military couldn't control, and when they couldn't control him, they destroyed the evidence." Gasps rippled. Someone's pen clattered to the floor. Hours earlier, Jonathan watched from his cell, flanked by a social worker and a new legal team. Devin Carter had finally convinced a senator to grant Thorne temporary access to the hearing via live stream. It wasn't freedom, but it was close enough to hope. "Do you think he'll actually say it?" Jonathan asked. Rosa, sitting beside him, met his gaze. He already did. Captain Grant detailed the mission in Mosul that no one wanted to admit happened. "It wasn't just a raid," he said. "It was a test. Scepter Dynamics embedded experimental neuroprogramming units into select soldiers. They called it echo conditioning, training the brain to bypass trauma, fear, hesitation. Turned us into weapons. Efficient, precise, unbreakable." He paused. "At least, that was the idea." He explained how Thorne had been one of the subjects. The most promising, the most dangerous. Until something went wrong. He refused to shoot a child. "We all saw the kid holding the detonator. Command said take the shot." But Jonathan lowered his rifle. Grant looked straight at the camera. They punished him for having a soul. In the aftermath of the hearing, the internet melted down. Redacted documents leaked. Photos surfaced. Former soldiers came forward, corroborating bits and pieces of Grant's testimony. It wasn't just about Thorne anymore. It was about every veteran who came home broken and was tossed aside for being inconvenient. Elaine Moss, from the Department of Veterans Affairs, confirmed the document's authenticity. She appeared on live television with a stack of papers labeled Echo Protocol and a determined expression. "This wasn't therapy," she said. "It was weaponization." The nation trembled. Back in Milton Harbor, the detention center received an urgent fax. "Immediate release pending further investigation." The guard handed it to Thorne with shaking hands. "You're going home." But Jonathan didn't move. "Where's home?" he asked. Rosa came up beside him and took his hand. "Wherever you decide to start again." That night, as Thorne walked out of the gates, the press flooded him with questions. But he didn't say a word. Not yet. He looked up at the sky, exhaled, and for the first time in years, felt the air hit his lungs without guilt. The first morning Jonathan Thorne spent outside the wire was quieter than he imagined. No marching boots. No metal doors slamming shut. Just the creak of an old swing set swaying in the breeze and a distant dog barking across the street. He was living in a safe house in Savannah, Georgia. A sleepy suburb chosen for its anonymity and lack of surveillance. Rosa had set it up with help from a veterans' rights nonprofit. To most neighbors, he was just another guy with a military duffel and too many cigarettes. But Thorne knew better. Freedom wasn't real. It was a delay. Captain Grant had disappeared the day after the hearing. Officially on leave. Unofficially? Off-grid. Devin Carter, now acting as Jonathan's legal advocate and de facto bodyguard, was tracing breadcrumbs, encrypted files, classified comms. Late-night visits from people who refused to leave names. "There's something bigger," Carter said one night, voice low. "This isn't just about you. Or Echo. This was a pilot program. A blueprint." Jonathan's jaw clenched. "You saying there's more of me out there?" "I'm saying some didn't make it back at all." 3 days later, it started. The first sign came in the form of a fire. Elaine Moss's apartment building burned down in D.C., 3 fatalities, 1 missing. Her body was never recovered. Official cause, electrical failure. But Jonathan knew the language of cover-ups. She'd known too much, and she'd paid the price. Then came the break-in. Jonathan woke at 2:37 a.m. to the sound of glass shattering. He moved silently, bare feet against tile. Muscles instinctively tensed. The shadow that entered through the kitchen window wasn't sloppy. It moved like a soldier. Trained. Surgical. Thorne took it down with a broken lamp and his bare hands. The man didn't speak a word. Didn't beg. Just smiled as he bled out. Tattoo on his wrist. A black triangle with a slash through it. "Who sent you?" Jonathan asked, breath ragged. The man coughed blood and said, "Echo never ended." The next day, Thorne opened the locker he hadn't touched since returning. Inside, a pair of combat boots, dog tags, and a weathered notebook from his last deployment. He flipped to the last page. Coordinates. Not military. Civilian. Deep in Arizona, in a section of desert known for 3 things: heat, dust, and disappearances. He called Carter. "We're going west." Meanwhile, in a corporate tower in San Diego, a man named Dr. Lucian Graves watched satellite footage of the Savannah house. "This is what happens when you let ghosts speak," he muttered. Graves was the original mind behind echo conditioning, a neuroscientist turned contractor with more funding than God and less oversight than a backyard meth lab. He hadn't expected Thorne to survive, much less expose them. "We need a cleaner team," he told the woman beside him, a cold-eyed operative named Mara Lane. Mara nodded. "Thorne won't make it to the desert." Graves smiled. "Make sure he does. Then burn it all down." 2 days later, Jonathan and Carter rolled into Tombstone, Arizona in a rental car with fake plates and a growing sense of dread. The coordinates led them to an abandoned mining site 20 miles outside the town. No one had been there in years, or so it seemed, under a collapsed shaft, hidden beneath crates and desert silence. They found it, a facility buried into the rock, powered by solar panels and surrounded by motion sensors. Someone had gone to great lengths to keep this place secret and alive. Inside, the walls were lined with cryo chambers. Some were empty, others still hummed. Carter stepped back, eyes wide. "What the hell is this place?" Jonathan stepped closer to one pod. Inside was a man who looked exactly like him, except younger, fresher, untouched by war. His file read, Thorne Variant 02. Status, dormant. Jonathan staggered. They didn't just program us. They cloned us. Chapter 6 ends not with a door closing, but 100 opening. Truth is no longer the goal. Survival is. Because the Echo Project didn't die, it evolved. And Thorne wasn't just the victim. He was the prototype. The courtroom had changed. Gone was the half-empty chamber that had once seen Gabriel Reed as a vagrant, a nuisance, a case number. In its place stood a packed gallery of journalists, veterans, students, and ordinary citizens, all waiting, breath held, for what would come next. Gabriel stood at the defense table. He looked different, though his clothes were the same. There was a weight to him, not one of weariness, but of meaning, like a statue unearthed after decades underground, revealed to the world again. Beside him, now not just his attorney, but a witness to something greater, stood Richard Harlow. Calm, resolved. Behind them, 3 officers in full military dress stood silently. Symbols of a system that had long forgotten Gabriel, now come to remember. The bailiff called the room to order as Judge Raymond Holloway entered. The judge, who had once looked at Gabriel through the lens of law, now looked at him as a man who had saved his life under fire. "Mr. Reed," he began, voice steady, "you are no longer just a defendant in a petty theft case. Your story, once buried in silence and shame, is now public record. But this court owes you more than a verdict. It owes you clarity and dignity." The prosecutor stood, holding a letter in his hands. "Your Honor," he said, less sure than the day before. "The state moves to formally dismiss all charges against Mr. Reed, with prejudice. In addition, we submit documentation of administrative failure on behalf of the Veterans Department, a failure which left Mr. Reed without his rightful pension or care for 15 years. A hush spread across the room. Gabriel looked around, blinking as though waking from a long sleep. Furthermore, the prosecutor added, "We recognize that Mr. Reed's actions, both in service and in silence, speak to the deepest kind of heroism, the kind that doesn't ask for medals, the kind that holds the country together when the country forgets to care." Judge Holloway turned to Gabriel. "You saved my life, Gabriel," he said plainly. "But you also reminded me why I became a judge, not to protect the system, but to protect those the system forgets." He removed his robe and stepped down from the bench. "This is not the court's moment. This is yours." As the audience stood, a young woman pushed through the gallery. Her eyes were wide with disbelief, and tears streamed freely down her cheeks. "Uncle Gabriel," she whispered. He turned, slowly, as though afraid to believe what he was seeing. "Ashley," he murmured, voice cracking. She ran to him, embracing him with a quiet sob. "We've been looking for you for years. Mom never stopped hoping. She passed last summer. She always believed you were still out there." Gabriel's face folded with emotion, not pain, but the release of it. He held her like he'd been waiting to feel warm for 1,000 winters. Days later, the story went national. Veterans groups launched campaigns. Donations flooded in. A single GoFundMe for Gabriel exceeded $300,000 in less than 48 hours. But what surprised everyone most wasn't the money or the attention. It was Gabriel himself. He declined TV appearances. He turned down book deals. But he agreed to speak at schools, community centers, and shelters. Always quietly. Always simply. One story in particular stuck with the country. At a school in Detroit, a teenager asked, "Mr. Reed, why didn't you fight harder for yourself? Why let them forget you?" Gabriel paused before answering. "I didn't need the world to remember me," he said. "I just needed to remember why I served and who I loved. That was enough to keep breathing." The silence that followed was profound. The Grady Initiative. In a joint effort, Congress passed a bill to establish the Grady Initiative, a legal and housing support program for homeless veterans named in honor of Gabriel Reed, whose real name had finally been made public with consent. It wasn't just a tribute. It was a beginning. At the opening ceremony of the program's first shelter, Gabriel stood quietly in front of a mural, him carrying a wounded soldier through smoke and fire. A 10-year-old boy who once saw Gabriel collecting bottles on the street had written an essay that won a city competition. Not everyone in torn clothes is broken. Some people wear their battles outside. And sometimes, heroes look like shadows. Gabriel read the essay with trembling hands. "That kid," he said, "sees clearer than most adults I've met." A late autumn morning. Leaves fall along the sidewalk near a new veterans center named the Holloway Home. Gabriel, now clean-shaven and dressed in modest clothing, tends the community garden outside. A small plaque sits under the first tree planted. "To those who serve, and those who are forgotten, may silence never steal their names again." Judge Holloway steps up beside him, holding 2 coffees. "You know," the judge says, handing Gabriel one, "I used to think justice was a matter of law, but you taught me it's a matter of memory." Gabriel takes the cup, nods. "Memory's the only armor I've got left." The 2 men sit in silence as the city moves around them, not as judge and defendant, but as 2 men who survived a war and found peace in the echo of each other's name.